15 or so seconds for other folks to enter the room before I start us off. So we'll just wait a few more seconds. Okay. Greetings, everyone, from Cambridge, Massachusetts. My name is Tarek Masoud. I'm the Ford Foundation Professor of Democracy and Governance at the John F. Kennedy School of Government and the co-editor of the Journal of Democracy. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you to today's discussion on the global impact of the U.S. election, hosted by the indomitable Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation, and co-sponsored by the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies at Harvard. So when I was in graduate school a really long time ago, I remember being quite taken by the principle of affected interest. This is the idea that the people who are most affected by a given policy or decision should be the ones with the most say over it. And now, by that principle, it isn't actually obvious that the only people who should be allowed to vote in American elections are Americans. After all, the lives of people all around the world are impacted very profoundly by what happens in Washington. I'm a scholar of the Middle East, and in my conversations with folks in the Arab world about this election, I observed a level of intensity of interest and concern that matches anything that you might see on this campus or elsewhere in the United States. When the election result was made apparent, we saw joy in the Arab world from those who thought Trump would bring an end to the wars in Gaza and Ukraine. And we saw despair from people who thought he would only make those conflicts worse. And there's above all a quite intense and unrelenting speculation about what this highly unpredictable, independent, iconoclastic, and unusual American president will mean for America's role in the world. Will America continue to be the indispensable nation, deeply involved in everything, everywhere, sometimes for good, sometimes for ill? Or will we turn inward? Will we withdraw behind the vast oceans that separate us from much of the rest of the world and leave that world to the tender ministrations of China or others who might try to fill America's shoes? So, to help us understand how this recent election is being viewed around the world by all those other interests that are so profoundly affected by it, and to help us understand what the Trump administration might portend for America's role in the world, we have with us the finest panel ever assembled on any topic in any place or time in human history. And I will briefly introduce our panelists, economizing on all of their great achievements in the interest of making sure that they can have more time to actually share their original insights. So the first panelist is Dr. Gloria Ayee. She is a gifted political scientist who teaches at both the Kennedy School and the Harvard Extension School, and she is a scholar of the politics of identity, race, and ethnic politics, with a particular focus on sub-Saharan Africa. Professor Jay Rosengard is a renowned scholar of public finance and public policy in Southeast Asia. He's the director of our Indonesia program, and he's the first person I call whenever I want to understand something about the world's largest Muslim democracy, i.e. Indonesia. Professor Tony Saich directs the Rajawali Institute for Asia. He's one of Harvard's giants in the study of Chinese politics, also the first person I ever taught with. And then finally, Professor Erica Chenoweth is one of our extraordinary deans here and a leading scholar of democracy and political resistance around the world. Before I come to each of the panelists, there are a couple of things I would like to note. The first is that today's discussion is being recorded. You will actually receive a link to that recording in an email following the conclusion of the event. You'll also be able to find it on the Ash Center's highly popular YouTube channel. But the point is, if you ask a question, you are consenting to have your voice and visage recorded for all time and beamed across the known universe. The second thing is we are absolutely going to reserve ample time for questions from the audience, and you can submit your questions anytime via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So I am now going to turn to our panelists, and I will start with Dr. Ayee. Gloria, if I may, you're a great scholar of Africa. As I mentioned, I've been talking to a lot of people in the Middle East and North Africa about the election, and there's an entire range of opinions. I would probably say the center of gravity of opinion in the Arab world seems to lean positive with respect to Trump's election, which is quite a puzzle for anyone who remembers what the first Trump administration was like for a lot of issues that people in the Middle East care about. How is this election viewed in sub-Saharan Africa? What do people in that vast continent, of course, and so I'm asking you to summarize a lot, but how do they see this?
Good day, everyone, and thank you, Tarek, for the question. It's a pleasure to join you and to talk about this really significant election and its implications for the globe and certainly for African nations. And as you mentioned, there are mixed reactions actually from African leaders, from people on the continent about Trump's reelection. So I'm really happy to speak to that and touch on the hopes and also some of the concerns that have been expressed. So as we know, Donald Trump's victory is really a pivotal moment in global politics. And I want to offer some comments on the broad implications of his win, with comments specifically on Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. In the immediate aftermath of the election, several African leaders actually extended their congratulations to President Trump, signaling a desire for continued and potentially expanded cooperation between their nations and the United States. Leaders from nations including Kenya, Nigeria, and then certainly also North Africa, Egypt, expressed their hope for strengthened diplomatic and economic relations during Trump's second term. And this actually reflects a pragmatic approach, recognizing the importance of maintaining strong ties with the United States. But as I mentioned, their responses are varied across the continent. While some leaders are optimistic about direct bilateral engagements, which could benefit their economic interests, others remain wary, especially given Trump's past administration and their experiences under that. A prominent concern that has been shared by many African leaders surrounds aid and economic support from the United States. There are some fears of potential cuts to U.S. aid to Africa, which could significantly affect development programs and also humanitarian assistance that is really crucial for many African nations today. And of course, Trump's inclination towards America First policies actually raises questions about future commitments and whether strategic interests will actually overshadow aid objectives to Africa. There's also significant apprehension about economic assistance and unease about reduced emphasis on multilateral cooperation. And these shifts may dilute collective efforts on globally impactful issues like climate change, which, as we know, affects or will have the potential to affect many African nations directly, and also on peacekeeping and health initiatives across the continent. And all of these areas are really of concern to African nations because they have traditionally relied on American partnership in these dimensions. Nevertheless, I should say that Trump's re-election does open some doors for strategic opportunities. And a few African leaders have expressed their hopes that there will be some potential benefits through closer bilateral trade agreements, which could potentially bypass some of the constraints multilateral dealings could impose. So there's a hope that Africa and African nations can leverage specific alliances to foster economic growth, particularly by aligning with sectors that will actually resonate with Trump's business-oriented outlook. And I would say in sub-Saharan Africa, of course, some political leaders have expressed interest in exploring robust economic partnerships that could attract American investments, focusing on things like infrastructure, energy, and technology. And these collaborations could significantly impact local economies if they are tapped effectively. So I'll stop there, and we can come back to this issue in more detail.
Gloria, before I go over to Professor Rosengard, one thing that I observe, at least in the Arab world, is that some of the enthusiasm for Trump, I think, comes from a feeling that he will not lean so heavily on governments in the region to enact democratic or human rights respecting reforms. Is that also part of the formula for how Trump's victory is being viewed in the sub-Saharan Africa?
Certainly it is. And in terms of human rights, that is a concern across the continent. But then again, given that many African nations have different approaches to addressing human rights issues, it could work in their favor, or it could not. And so especially given that Trump's administration would be focusing on human rights issues based on favored strategic alliances, that has the potential to really shape the nature of the relationship with specific African countries.
This is fascinating. Oh, we'll have a lot more.
And I'll quickly just add that there are some concerns that the foreign policy agenda might deprioritize international human rights, which conflict with national interests. So certainly we should keep an eye out for that.
All right, this is great. Lot of threads to pull on. Let me come to Dr. Jay Rosengard. So, Jay, you're a great scholar of Southeast Asia. I'm particularly obsessed, as you know, with Indonesia. But you can speak about the entire region or just about Indonesia. Indonesia itself this year elected its own president who, if you squint a little bit, seems to have some Donald Trump quality, certainly has been characterized as a populist in the mode of Donald Trump. That's the Prabowo, the former general. How are people viewing Trump's election in Indonesia?
Well, if I may, I'd like to talk about the region in general for a moment and give many examples from Indonesia, since it's the largest economy in the region, the most populous country, and so on, member of the G20, and so on. But even though Southeast Asia is comprised of a very diverse group of countries, different political systems, different economic structures, different cultures, histories, religions, surprisingly, the impact of the U.S. election is remarkably similar across the region, and it's mostly positive in creating many potential opportunities, but also with common risks. So if I might begin where you left off, Tarek, beginning with the personalities of the political leaders and common political tendencies, President-elect Trump's fondness for autocrats actually bodes well for many Southeast Asian countries, unfortunately, today. You have the obvious, the communist-led Vietnam, Sultan-led Brunei, the generals fighting to cling on to power in Myanmar. You've got the generals who have actually retained much of their influence behind the veneer of a civilian-led government in Thailand. But this is also true of Southeast Asia's competitive democracies in the Philippines and Indonesia. The current president of the Philippines, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., is the son of a former de facto dictator. The newly elected president of Indonesia, as you mentioned, Prabowo Subianto, was once married to former President Suharto's daughter and was head of special forces under President Suharto, and he has been accused of war crimes in Timor-Leste and Papua. He's been accused of human rights violations by kidnapping, torturing, and disappearing democracy advocates near the end of Suharto's reign. And although President Prabowo has denied all of these alleged crimes and has never been tried or convicted on these charges, he was dishonorably discharged from his own army after the fall of Suharto, and he was banned from entry in the United States for 20 years until President-elect Trump lifted the ban during his first administration or his first term in office after President Prabowo became defense minister under the previous administration. President Prabowo has also received military training in the United States, and he has already visited President-elect Trump at the Mar-a-Lago Club. So you've got these very important tendencies. And then in terms of diplomatic and security relations, it is likely current policies will continue because the strategic interests of the United States and Southeast Asia remain, and that's most importantly balancing China's military threat with U.S. security ties. And Tony will probably talk a little bit about that in his remarks. Southeast Asian nations will also be pleased that the Trump administration is unlikely to raise sensitive issues like, as we talked about, human rights. That's a relief to many of the countries in Southeast Asia, given his transactional nature, at least in his first administration. And then we come to the world's largest Muslim majority country, Indonesia. They are unlikely to be threatened with sanctions such as travel bans. They were also spared that during the first Trump administration. And I think largely because President-elect Trump has invested in 2 real estate development projects in Indonesia. There's the Trump Lido residences in West Java, and then the Trump Bali residences. And as I said, he's very transactional. And I should also add that these investments are via his local partner, Hari Tanusudibio, who is he's a politically well-connected tycoon, and he actually attended the election watch with Trump at Mar-a-Lago. So for reasons probably not widely known, I think Indonesia's in a pretty good place. In terms of economic relations, President-elect Trump's animosity towards China, coupled with multinationals' efforts to strengthen supply chain resiliency and their China Plus One investment strategy, I think offers several Southeast Asian countries an opportunity to be that plus one nation for foreign direct investment. And in addition, China itself could shift some domestic manufacturing to Southeast Asia to evade punitive trade tariffs. So there are opportunities in Trump's presumed foreign policy, but with these potential positive impacts are some caveats and risks. The caveats are that no one really knows what President-elect Trump will actually try to do, or what he will actually be able to do once he's in office. Although he's potentially in a more powerful position than during his first term, given the trifecta results of the election, the Republicans capture the White House, they retain control of the House of Representatives, and they took control of the Senate. The House and Senate majorities are very slim, and it's not clear whether the Republicans will be able to maintain party discipline in support of the president. The major risk, I say the 2 risks, is that Southeast Asian leaders will not be able to take advantage of these potential opportunities because of domestic governing challenges. In Indonesia, for example, there are very severe funding constraints, and there's a powerful coalition of oligarchs who will push very hard to protect their businesses under the guise of economic nationalism, which would make it a very unattractive place for FDI. And the other risk is how Trump's policies in the Middle East will affect domestic politics in Indonesia and Malaysia. Neither country has diplomatic relations with Israel. It's a super sensitive issue, and that could hamper any kind of transactional economic benefits in Indonesia and Malaysia. And I'll stop here, but I, of course, welcome comments, questions, protests in our Q&A session.
All right. Well, there's a lot to pull on there as well. Would it be fair to say, Jay, that part of the reason that there may be some warmth towards Trump in the region of the world that you study, and particularly a place like Indonesia, despite the fact that they have reasons to think that Trump doesn't think terribly much of, people in the global South, that Trump was not terribly did not pursue what most would consider constructive policies on the issue of Israel-Palestine, which people in Indonesia really care about. So despite that, is the reason that people may still feel warmly towards Trump despite that, is it precisely because he's transactional and they just think, finally, we have an American president who isn't a hypocrite and is just very nakedly about self-interest, America's interest, and isn't talking to us about human rights on the one hand, while pursuing policies that undermine human rights on the other?
I think there are two reasons. The first, exactly as you articulated. He shoots straight and he really tries to do what he says he's going to do. So they kind of know what they're getting. And the second is the same reason that Prabowo won by a landslide. He won by so much there wasn't even a runoff. He got almost 60% of the votes. And you're trying to figure out, how can this accused war criminal, have a landslide across all demographics? And like Trump, he presents an image of a strong man, strong ruler, man of convictions. And they kind of have gravitated towards that model of strong, firm leadership. So the transactional nature plus this image of being strong,
Yeah.
I think goes a long way, despite all the arguments you just made, why it's a bit counterintuitive.
Yeah. Thank you, Jay. That's very, very helpful. So I'll come now to Professor Saich, our great scholar of China, and I think the what Trump means for the U.S.-China relationship could and should be its own webinar or maybe series of webinars. I looked at some of Trump's statements about the Chinese president, and on the one hand, he talks quite warmly about him. He said, I think to the Wall Street Journal, I have a very strong relationship with President Xi. He's actually a really good friend. And then he says, I don't want to call him a friend, but I got along with him great. So on the one hand, he really plays up his positive relationship with other strongmen. But on the other side, he's also said, I can really force Xi to back down on the issues of contention between us because, quote, he knows I'm swear word crazy. This is what President Trump said. So what do the Chinese actually think about Trump? Do they think this is a fellow strong man with whom we can do business, or do they think this guy's crazy? Like, how do they think of this person?
Yeah, thanks, Tarek. You saved me having to say the comment about being crazy, but anyway, I think the key question to this is which Trump actually turns up. And we've all stressed the unpredictability of Trump, but why it's crucial in this context, and this impacts more globally, is the Trump that actually turns up in the China relationship the deal maker? Is he actually putting this threat of tariffs because he wants to bring China to some kind of trade deal, which he feels will be favorable for the US? Or is it the Trump, the aggressive competitor, that really wants to be number one and is determined to crush any competition that might threaten that? And that's going to determine a lot of the way the policies kind of unfold over time. I just wanted to make a couple of general comments. Then secondly, very briefly, some reactions from China, and then three key issues, which I think have come to the fore from what Trump has said so far. I think that, although the election was fought on domestic issues, as we're seeing here, the global ramifications are enormous. And I think there was a sort of a growing support within the United States of America for a different kind of approach to its external relations. I think we've seen that there's a general view that other countries are perhaps free riding on US largesse. There's a growing decline in the faith in international institutions, be they political or be they economic. I think there's a tiredness of carrying out what they see as global responsibilities. And of course, then there's the question of the conflicts overseas. The first responses from China was they used a phrase from a Qing novel, The Dream of the Red Chamber, which says all crows under heaven are the same black. The problem for China is they're not the same. And even though a Harris and Trump administration would have been equally tough on China, I think it's quite clear that Trump will be much harder to determine what he's going to do and develop counter strategies. The other phrase which was supportive of Trump winning was a phrase in Chinese, 川建国, which means Trump, the builder of our nation. And what he meant by that was not the builder of the American nation, but he would be so chaotic and catastrophic that he would destroy the American nation, which would inevitably lead to the rise of the Chinese nation. So in terms of what he's proposing and what he's going to do, we see that his key appointments are all China hawks, quite clearly. And in fact, just yesterday, he added the proposal that Peter Navarro would be his senior economic advisor and senior counselor for trade and manufacturing. And of course, we know Navarro was a big pusher of tariffs as the weapon to get what they wanted. One interesting thing following on from Jay's comments about impacts broader across the region, which maybe open opportunities for China. It was interesting, an organization in Singapore does studies of elites' perceptions of the US and China. And this year, for the first time, China was viewed more favorably than the United States of America. It was something like 61% to 39%. Last year, it had been a slight issue in favor of the United States. And I think a lot of that is to do with the Gaza conflict. That really has been disturbing for many. And in fact, when they looked at, they asked the question, what is the biggest geopolitical threat to you in the region? The Israeli-Gaza conflict, Hamas conflict rather, came out as the number one, more important than the tensions in the South China Seas or the conflict in Ukraine. I think that's very instrumental in trying to understand how the region is going to be responding. So let me then briefly, in the time I've got left, touch on three important aspects, I think, from the administration that will impact on the relationship and how China responds. And we can draw this from what he did in his first administration, the people he's appointed, and what some of the right-wing think tanks have been saying. The first, of course, is his beloved gift to the world, and that's tariffs. And of course, he said it's 60% tariffs for China, not going sparing. And then again, the key question there is what I said earlier, I think, is Trump's intention to use those tariffs as a negotiating tactic to get a phase 2 trade deal. And of course, that's what he did in the first administration. He used those tariffs to push China towards a phase 1 trade deal, which he got, but he was very dissatisfied with. And then, of course, COVID blew it out of the water. Or is the intention that they really intended to harm further China's growth prospects? And I would say that many of his advisors see that as the strategy they would like him to adopt as a way to push decoupling further. It's inevitable that some kind of tariffs are going to be instituted, and I think the permanent normal trading status will be revoked. That seems to be an easy issue. But of course, that's going to hit pushback from influential business leaders about blanket tariffs. Many people have important businesses, investments there. Elon Musk, his great buddy, the two suns in the sky, he produces 50% plus of his Teslas within China. And of course, China is much better prepared this time around for resisting and counteracting to those tariffs. The second important issue, I'll touch on each briefly, is the question of Taiwan. And the advisors and think tanks see support as essential for Taiwan, not only for its own sake, because of what they see as protecting US interests in the Pacific more broadly. But Trump has actually expressed quite ambivalence about the position of Taiwan. Again, his buddy Elon Musk has said, well, it's like America's Hawaii, not entirely reassuring. But he's also said that, Taiwan needs to increase its defense spending to 10% of GDP. Impossible. It's about 2.4% at the moment. He's also said we're nothing better than an insurance company. We don't get anything out of it. And he also accused Taiwan of stealing the US semiconductor business. So that's going to be another point of contention, both within the US, but will have major ramifications throughout the region. And the last thing I just want to say very briefly is the small yard, high fence. The yard's going to get bigger and the fence is going to get higher. I think whoever won the election, that was going to be the case. There's going to be much enhanced programs for controls over the technologies of the future. We saw the Biden administration just introduce some new controls in the last day or so. And who controls the setting of standards for those technologies of the future will have enormous geopolitical influence in addition to economic gains. And that's where the US and China is really competing most ardently. And it's the one area, going back to what Jay was saying, most of the countries in the region and globally don't really want to be forced to choose. Many like the investment engagement and trade engagement from China, but many in the Asia region quite like sitting under the security umbrella from the US. But when it comes to this one area of technology, they're going to have to choose. You're not going to be able to run a Western technology and a Chinese technology at the same time.
Tony, before we come to Professor Chenoweth, just the fence and yard metaphor, just for folks who may not be familiar with it. So the yard, what refers to the technologies that the U.S. will want to keep fenced off or protected from China, and the idea is the yard will be small. In other words, it won't be everything. We'll still cooperate with China on a bunch of things, but there'll be a small number of things around which we erect a very high. Is that the idea?
Yeah, it's essentially the Biden's approach, which Jake Sullivan has expressed about, some kind of strategic competition that in certain areas will compete with China. And as you just said, that's going to be primarily in the key technologies of the future. It's going to be the bio industry, it's going to be semiconductors, it's going to be that technology. But the fence won't be that high because we want to cooperate in a whole range of other areas to do with trade and investment, to which China has said, kind of stuff that, either we get on with everything or we don't get on at all.
Can I also just be quickly about the Taiwan issue? You mentioned that Trump has surrounded himself by a lot of China hawks, including our alumnus Peter Navarro and our other alumnus Hegseth, although I don't know if he's going to actually end up being Secretary of Defense.
And he has Elise Stefanik as well.
Oh, right. But Elise Stefanik's a Harvard alumnus, but not a Kennedy School.
No, that's right. She's an undergrad.
Yeah, but the I saw a quote that President Trump it was attributed to President Trump about Taiwan, where he said, I can get Xi to back down because I can tell him, if you try to make a move with Taiwan, I'm going to raise your tariff to 150, 200%. And actually, if you were somebody who really cares about the American security commitment to Taiwan, that felt like Trump was just putting a price on China's retaking of Taiwan. And if you're the Chinese, you'll be like, oh, so it's just a 200% tariff for what, 5 years? Maybe we'll pay that price.
Mm-hmm.
Am I correct to be concerned that Trump's major strategy for deterring China is from retaking Taiwan is simply to charge a tariff?
Well, apart from the thing you said earlier about his craziness, and that's going to keep Xi Jinping away, that really is about as far as he's gone. But having said that, if you look at sort of reports from some of the groups like Heritage Foundation, they have talked about, increasing the arming of Taiwan, upgrading the weapons sales, concluding some kind of trade agreement with Taiwan, and basically boosting the relationships. So that's also part of the strategy. I think from China's perspective, it knows what it's going to get because it dealt with this in the first administration. And I think it's sort of gearing itself up to the point where, yes, they will have an impact, but they're not going to have the kind of impact that the first administration had, or that perhaps the incoming Trump administrations thinks it will have. It's diversifying trade, it's building up its own native capabilities, and it will hit back, as we saw just in the last couple of days. And last time it hit back quite strategically. hit American farmers. You know, it could reroute soy, other corn to Brazil away from the US. And that could then begin to erode some of the heartland of President Trump's support. Didn't do it last time, but it could do it this time.
Thank you, Tony. Lots more to talk about. Professor Erica Chenoweth. So, you know, with all of our distinguished panelists, I've been asking them to talk about the reaction to President Trump's election in the particular part of the world or country that they study. And, you know, you are you stride across the world. But if there's a country that Erica Chenoweth studies, it is the country of those who are trying to get and keep democracy around the world. And so the citizens of that democratic or would-be democratic nation across the world, how does the Trump election look to them? And, you know, I just to you know, I was thinking yesterday, I was just glued to my phone following the play-by-play of the declaration of martial law in South Korea, which I thought was the most significant event happening in the world at that moment. And I was deeply gratified that it all seemed to end in one day. But I also thought to myself, wow, if President Yoon Suk Yeol had just done this move under a Trump administration, might there have been a different outcome? So what does President Trump portend for the cause of getting and keeping democracy around the world?
Thanks, Tarek. I mean, I think other colleagues have alluded to this, but I'll start by saying two things. The first is that you know, the U.S. election wasn't happening in a vacuum. We are far from the heady days of either 1991 or even 2010, for that matter. And over the last 18 years in a row, according to different measures of global democracy has been in retreat around the world. We're still in the midst of a global democratic recession, and that's as true this year, the so-called year of elections around the world, as it was last year and probably will be next year. So what's been going on over the last 18 years in a row is that countries that were already autocratic have become more autocratic. So that's like the Russia-Turkey situation. Some countries that were emerging democracies have reversed and gone backward over the course of that period. And then some countries that were kind of advanced or established or consolidated democracies began to deconsolidate. So that's why you're seeing, even though there's the occasional breakthrough in a kind of democratic advancement in a country or two every year, on the aggregate, we're seeing declines everywhere. And these declines have been sort of accelerating over the last few years. So I'll say that first. The second thing I'll say is that, you know, when it comes to those who are interested in, as you call it, kind of promoting and protecting democracy where it exists, if you think about the particular foreign policies or promises of foreign policies that have been articulated by the administration, you can understand why some of our closest kind of allied democracies, for example, OECD countries or those in Europe, would be somewhat alarmed. So if you think about the sort of promise to try to implement an end to the Ukraine-Russia war that looks more like Russia's plan than Ukraine's aspirations. This is quite significant, not just because of the demonstration effects that it causes in Europe, but because it's a pretty significant difference, at least in the post-World War II era, for the United States to pick the side of an autocracy and an autocracy versus democracy war. Or at least an emerging democracy that's trying to democratize and is attacked by an autocrat and a kind of geostrategic rival of the United States. For the United States to change course and say, you know what, we're not going to continue to support either the sovereignty or the democratic aspirations of our erstwhile democratic ally, but instead are going to choose the side of an autocratic government that's also a geostrategic rival from the US, understandably gives our European allies now a lot of jitters, right? In part because of different analyses that they might have about Russia's broader aspirations for expansion, or at least subversion in its regional rivals, and the fact that many countries in Europe share a border with Russia and are worried about this, right? So I was in Norway just the end of the week of the election, and many people forget that Norway does share a border with Russia on the northern side, and they're understandably quite concerned. In fact, some of my colleagues told me that they had received in the mail from the government a flyer about how to keep your family alive for a week if you lose access to power and heat and other kind of vital subsistence supplies, and encouraging people to prepare for, say, a 48-hour energy collapse in the country. And the subtext was like, we don't really know what's coming next, but we just want our population to be prepared. And this is the type of kind of popular education that we have not seen, right, since the collapse of the Soviet Union among our democratic allies in Europe. So that's on the sort of country democracy to democracy side of the ledger. On the people who are striving for democracy, civil society, pro-democratic civil society around the world, I'll say two things. So first, one of the kind of best known phrases about how to understand a policy is, predict a policy, is that personnel is policy. So you take a look at who is appointed in certain points of responsibility, and you'll have a better sense of what the inclinations are, both of the president and of that person's direct administration of their role, than if you just look at sort of campaign promises and things. So if you think about who's been directed to lead the US State Department, we have Marco Rubio, who interestingly has expressed passionate hopes for the democratic aspirations of people in Venezuela and Cuba, which is good news to the sort of pro-democratic movements in those places. But there's also the be careful what you wish for. When the sleeping giant turns its gaze to the south, usually it doesn't turn out too well for most of the countries south of the U.S. border. So that this is kind of an interesting paradox. On the other hand, personnel is policy. And one of the things that has been kind of promised, and that more will be revealed about the degree of the cuts, is that the civil service will be gutted, right? And what I'll say about democratic civil society in many countries around the world is that it doesn't so much matter who the Secretary of State is or who the president is, but it really matters that you have people in the civil service who are career foreign service officers who are serving in an embassy, or who are providing and implementing aid programs that help to enable civil society development, who are available for consultations about rule of law, who are quietly but consistently promoting the U.S. kind of erstwhile commitment to building rule of law and countering corruption and things like that. And if those people disappear because those programs are completely cut and the Foreign Service shrinks to an infinitesimal size, then that's a very significant change and will be different around the world for those who sought out those resources to help them pursue their aspirations. The other sector that is important in this regard is the sort of transnational social movement or transnational civil society sector. That sector too is under stress. In the United States anyway, it's awfully clear that many of those folks are reorienting their attention to supporting and defending U.S. pro-democracy civil society. And so they're a little distracted at the moment. And I just think what that means is that the United States is not going to be necessarily a reliable partner on the democracy side right now. And so people are adjusting to that. Movements are adjusting to it, and countries are adjusting to it. The second and last point I'll make about this is that, one of the things that's very hard to foresee is that, and this is true for any presidential administration, you can sort of say what your policy is and what your strategy is, and then the world serves up a whole heap of crises that distract you, that put you off course, that you have no idea no idea we're coming and have to figure out how to respond to. And the response is often not quite very coherent. And so I think that that's just an important thing to know, is that we can speculate about what we think based on statements and rhetoric and prior behavior in the first administration might happen. But boy, the world is a very complicated place, and nobody knows actually what the future holds. And whoever's in power is going to have to adjust to whatever comes.
Just tremendous, Erica. And there's so many questions I wanna ask you. I mean, when you were talking, all I could think of was, I really want Erica to talk about how afraid we should be about genuine democratic backsliding in the United States. Is something like what happened in South Korea on the cards here? That's not our remit here. So I will resist asking you that question. Instead, ask you a different follow-up. You alluded in your remarks to a kind of global turn toward populism. That's one of the ingredients for the trouble that democracy finds itself in around the world. And so, when we understand that global trend, Trump is of a piece with it, right? He is just the American manifestation of this thing that's happening around the world. But there's a question as to the question that comes to my mind is whether, now that America has once again gone in this populist direction, does that accelerate the trend elsewhere? Because, of course, America is a source of emulation for so many countries and people around the world. And so, to what extent are you worried that the election of this gentleman, Donald Trump, who by many accounts has demonstrated an imperfect commitment to democracy, to what extent is that going to accelerate the appearance of other would-be autocrats, populists, et cetera, around the world?
Yeah, I mean, I think his first election in 2016 certainly saw the emboldenment of other likewise characters emerging on the global scene, including in many of the kind of OECD countries in Latin America, et cetera. And I think, what happens when you see a breakthrough of the kind that we saw in this last election, that further emboldens, others to sort of either resurrect an erstwhile campaign, like we might see in the Bolsonaro case or something like that, or or at least legitimates the argument they've been making to their own coalition partners that this is a good time for this. And, like you said, Tarek, I mean, it's important to note that this year, the year of elections, was the only year in recorded elections, really, since 1905, where every single incumbent lost vote share. Now, that doesn't mean that every incumbent lost, but every single incumbent, whether they were right, left, center, populist, establishment, you name the flavor, every single one lost vote share. So we're in a global anti-establishment, anti-incumbent wave that probably is related to the economic headwinds and the sort of, knock-on effects of COVID and a whole bunch of other interesting cultural backlash things that are going on. So kind of, I think the emergence of Trump onto that scene is, as you say, part of the broader global trend. But, I was as I mentioned, when I was in Norway, there was a ton of talk about this survey that had just gone out the week before the US election, where they were asking their own population, which of the candidates would you vote for if you had a vote? And everybody was talking about this result that like something like a majority of men between the ages of 18 and 29 or whatever said that they would vote for Trump in Norway. And that, it legitimates a certain model, right? It creates a type of candidate caste type for others to emulate. And so I'm not going to say it's the most important thing explaining these outcomes, but it's not unimportant either.
Yeah, as I like to say, testosterone is a dangerous drug. So I think now we have about 10 minutes. So I want to bring in the audience. You can submit your questions in the Q&A. I already have 11 questions there. And if your name is recorded there, then I will say your name. So You can submit your question anonymously if you'd prefer not to have your name shared. So the first question is from our alumnus, Joshua Polachek. Nice to see you in the audience, Joshua. And it's a question for all of the panelists. He wants to know your thoughts on the return of a Trump administration for the global transition away from hydrocarbons and the broader impact that Trump's election will have on a global response to climate change. And so why don't we go in the order in which we have people have been participating. So we'll start with Dr. Ayee. Do I need to? Okay.
Yes. Thanks. I was just having a little bit of trouble unmuting myself. Thanks for that really great question. So when we're thinking about the response that we should consider in terms of the return of a Trump administration as it relates to the global transition away from hydrocarbons and then the potential of extension of the fossil fuel asset bubble, there's quite a bit to unpack here. So I'll start by saying the return of a Trump administration actually represents a significant point of consideration for the global transition away from hydrocarbons and the broader coordinated response to climate change. If we think about the previous Trump administration, and so we're looking historically, Trump has been an advocate for deregulation in the energy sector, and this really underscores energy independence primarily through the continued use of fossil fuels like oil and natural gas. And so this approach has implications for the global effort to transition away from hydrocarbons. And the Trump administration is likely to advocate for fossil fuel development and probably slow down the global transition away from hydrocarbons, which would extend the life of fossil fuel assets potentially. So prioritizing energy policies that favor increased exploration and exploitation of fossil resources would find the US encouraging similar policies among other nations, especially those that have historically tended to be heavily dependent on fossil fuel economies.
Great. Jay, Tony, Erica, thoughts on this question, or should I take another question?
A brief comment on bringing in Southeast Asia. I would say that the prospects are very discouraging, probably a lot of backsliding. It's based on two things. One would be U.S. domestic policy, if it's consistent with Trump's first administration and his pledges. And the problem, again, take Indonesia, which has a lot of fossil fuels and used to be a member of OPEC. There are very powerful vested interests in the whole chain, from mining to refining to production, take or pay contracts for power producers. And to deal with those powerful interests in that type of climate, no pun intended, I think it will be a big hit to Indonesia's pledges to decarbonize and go green, despite their abundant alternative fuel sources, hydro, solar, geo. They have that, but how do you compete with and this was also the same problem to the previous president, where a senior cabinet minister also had a interest in several mines. So Indonesia has made a lot of pledges. They would be expensive, and I had mentioned earlier the budget constraints. This kind of gives them an excuse to go really slow on this, which I think would have a significant global impact.
Great. Tony?
Yeah, just very quickly, two things. I mean, the Heritage Foundation has said that it wants America to abandon green technology promotion because those technologies are dominated by China. It ain't going to happen. And I'm less pessimistic than some, because this essentially is going to be driven by the markets. And the markets are already within the US moving towards a different kind of economy, despite, not just because of the IRA, but because of just general trends. And I agree with Jay, yes, for certain countries, this is going to be a defense for the existing political economy to resist the shifts. But I think there's a lot of momentum now building that is going to mean, even despite Trump being a climate change denier, I think there's a lot of momentum building that will resist the worst possible effects of a second Trump administration. So I'm not so pessimistic as some.
Yeah, yeah. Erica, do you have thoughts on this question? Okay, so I'll come to you actually, Erica, for the next question. We only have 4 minutes, so I'm going to skip a bunch of questions. There are two really excellent questions put in the chat by Charlotte Disley, and I'm going to try to combine them into one question. The first she asks is about Elon Musk. He has, we know that he funded President Trump's campaign. And if you think that in funding President Trump's campaign, he has been aiding a movement that, if it's not anti-democratic, may be considered anti-liberal, the question is, to what extent now do we need to fear that Musk and others like Musk will be emboldened to fund illiberal movements around the world? And, sort of related question again from Charlotte Disley, does all of this really portend the end of the liberal international order? And so, Erica, that's a perfect question for you.
Yeah, so thank you. I think there's a lot of speculation about the end of the international liberal order, and I think there are really 3 important elements, I think, of the international liberal order. There's the overlapping international security institutions like the United Nations, and then various alliances that have maintained predictability and stability in collective security, like NATO, over the sort of post-war period. There are overlapping economic cooperative institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, and a variety of other kind of practices to try to stabilize and make more profitable global financial markets and things like that. And then there's the sort of global commitment to democracy. And as you mentioned at the outset, I think Tarek and others have alluded to, all 3 of those have experienced a lot of stress. All 3 of the sort of triangles of the sides of the triangle of the international liberal order, along with kind of a fundamental kind of degradation of the norms and the shared consensus that say democracy or kind of liberal ideals should be the ones that everyone should aspire to. And, there's a lot more kind of challenge to that collective understanding today than there was before. And yet there still isn't a very clear articulation of what else would be there. So if not that, what are we going back to? Are we just going back to like bare mercantilist policies? Are we going back to multilateralism? Are we actually in a bipolar system? Jenny Lind and her recent international security article kind of argues maybe we are, or others are still arguing that the United States is just still supreme in all important dimensions, and that the stresses are just stresses and they're not actually unravelings. So it's a very live debate. I think that certainly the consensus is gone. Whether the actual sustained institutional cooperation, et cetera, remain is something we will find out. And I think I'll punt on the Musk question, but simply say that the particular brand of authoritarianism that we're seeing around the world is one in which oligarchic interests are easily indulged as a way to kind of reinforce the sort of power holders' control of capital within the society, and vice versa. So I think it's a descriptive similarity, if not identical in form.
Yeah. So we are now actually at the end of our time, and so I'll ask the other panelists forbearance. I think what we need to do is have another panel to discuss these issues, and maybe in that second panel we can end on an optimistic note. I think the most optimistic thing I heard in this discussion is we'll have to wait and see. Um, so maybe there is some optimism in that uncertainty. And I actually am fairly optimistic. I think the forces of good will win out both in this country and abroad. I want to thank every member of the audience for their listening attentively and for submitting such great questions. We were only able to get to a tiny fraction of them. I also want to thank the Ash Center team, particularly Melissa Danello and Danielle Wireman, for producing this event. And I very much hope that we will see you at future events of the Ash Center for